On the night of September 13, 1942, a Marine major did something no manual ever taught, no doctrine ever endorsed, and no sane commander would ever order. He stood up, fully exposed, under enemy machine gun fire, not to retreat, not to charge, but to become a human target, to draw Japanese fire onto himself so his Marines could see where to shoot back. This single act of calculated self-sacrifice held a ridgeline that should have been overrun, saved an airfield that should have been lost, and changed the course of the Pacific War. This is the story of that impossible night, and the man who refused to let his line break. Guadalcanal was nothing, a malarial speck in the Solomon Islands, covered in jungle so dense that sunlight never reached the forest floor. Yet by August 1942, this island had become the most important piece of real estate in the Pacific theater. The reason was simple: Henderson Field. A single strip of crushed coral now served as the only operational American airfield between Hawaii and Australia. Whoever controlled Henderson Field controlled the sea lanes. Whoever controlled the sea lanes would decide whether the war moved toward Tokyo or toward Sydney. The Japanese understood this perfectly. Major General Kiyotaki Kawaguchi commanded approximately 6,000 troops, primarily elite veterans of combat in China and the Philippines. His plan was elegant. Approach from the south through jungle the Americans considered impassable, seize the ridge overlooking the airfield, and reduce Henderson Field to rubble. The operation was scheduled for the night of September 13th. The Americans were not blind. Intelligence reports, prisoner interrogations, and aerial reconnaissance all suggested something major was building. But intelligence suggested many things: an amphibious landing, a paratroop drop, another naval bombardment. The jungle consumed patrols and revealed nothing. Colonel Merritt Edson, commanding the 1st Marine Raider Battalion and elements of the 1st Parachute Battalion, together forming a provisional brigade of roughly 830 men, had positioned his force along the ridge south of Henderson Field based more on intuition than hard evidence. Edson was 44 years old, a career officer with a face like weathered teak and a reputation for cold tactical brilliance. His men called him Red Mike for his rust-colored hair, but never to his face. He was not a man who invited familiarity. He did not joke, did not drink, did not write sentimental letters home. He studied terrain, calculated fields of fire, and expected his orders to be executed without discussion. On September 12th, he walked the ridge with his battalion commanders and said only this: "They're coming from the south. They'll hit us tomorrow night. Make sure your men dig in." Then he returned to his command post and waited. Among Edson's officers was Major Kenneth Bailey, 34 years old, commanding Company C. If Edson was ice, Bailey was fire. He was a Midwesterner from Illinois, the son of a railroad worker who had risen through the ranks by competence rather than connections. His Marines loved him for it. He laughed easily, cursed fluently, and possessed the rare gift of making exhausted men feel capable of one more mile, one more night without sleep. He had led night patrols, ambushed Japanese supply columns, and earned a reputation as an officer who never asked his men to do anything he wouldn't do first. More importantly, he possessed something Edson lacked: the ability to sense when men were about to break, and the instinct to reach them before they did. The two men respected each other but operated in different registers. Edson commanded from maps and reports. Bailey commanded from the smell of fear and the sound of breathing. On the evening of September 13th, as the sun dropped behind the jungle canopy and the first rumors of movement drifted up from the southern approaches, Bailey walked the line with his platoon leaders. The position was not good. Edson's ridge was barely a ridge at all, a low coral spine, perhaps 40 feet above the surrounding terrain at its highest point, running roughly north-south for about 1,000 yards. The western slope dropped away into dense jungle. The eastern slope was more gradual, covered in kanai grass that stood 6 feet tall and rustled in the evening breeze like a living thing. Visibility was perhaps 20 yards before the grass swallowed everything. Foxholes were shallow. Coral broke entrenching tools and turned every shovelful into an hour's labor. Ammunition was adequate but not abundant. The Marines carried M1903 Springfield rifles, most of them. Some had the new M1 Garand, but not many. They had Browning automatic rifles, a few light machine guns, mortars that worked when they felt like it, and grenades that were more reliable. They had no armor, no artillery worth mentioning, and no reserves. If the line broke, there was nowhere to fall back to except Henderson Field itself, and if Henderson Field fell, there was nowhere to fall back to except the sea. Bailey knew this. His Marines knew this. They dug their foxholes a little deeper, checked their ammunition a little more carefully, and did not talk much as darkness came on. Around 8 in the evening, the jungle to the south erupted with sound. Whistles, screams, metal clanging on metal, psychological warfare, an attempt to fray nerves before the assault began. It worked. Men gripped their rifles tighter and tried to convince themselves they were ready. The first probing attacks came around 9. Small groups of Japanese infantry materialized from the kunai grass, testing the line for weak points. The Marines fired, the Japanese withdrew, then attacked again 50 yards west. Then again, 100 yards east. They were mapping the defenses, finding the gaps. Around 10:30, the jungle went silent. Not quiet, silent. The insects stopped. The birds stopped. Veterans knew what that meant. Bailey moved along the line, crouching low, whispering, "They're coming now. Wait for targets. Aim low." Then the ridge exploded. Not from grenades or mortars, though those came too, but from the weight of 3,000 men hitting an 830-man line at once. The Japanese assault came in waves. Not in neat parade ground formations, but in loose, flowing masses that moved through the darkness like water finding cracks. They screamed as they came, "Banzai! Marine, you die!" Not from fanaticism but from doctrine, a tactic designed to disorient defenders and mask the sound of movement. It was extraordinarily effective. Marines who had been calm 30 seconds earlier found themselves firing wildly at shadows, at voices, at nothing. Muzzle flashes lit the kunai grass in stuttering bursts. Tracers arced overhead, Grosvenor comets burning through the night. Japanese machine guns opened up from positions no one had spotted, raking the American foxholes with grazing fire that forced men to press themselves into the coral and prey. The ridge became a nightmare rendered in sound and darkness. You couldn't see who you were shooting at, couldn't see your squad leader, couldn't see anything beyond the flash of your own rifle. Communication dissolved into shouting. Orders became screams. The neat defensive line Edson had drawn on his map disintegrated into 100 isolated firefights, each one a desperate, private war fought by men who had no idea if anyone else was still alive. Bailey's company held the center, where Japanese pressure was most intense. Within 20 minutes, his right flank was collapsing. The volume of fire from that sector dropped, then stopped, then resumed 50 yards further back. The Marines were retreating. Bailey didn't wait for orders. He grabbed every Marine not actively fighting and formed them into an improvised counterattack force. Perhaps 30 men. "We plug that gap or die," he told them. Then he moved forward into the darkness toward the sound of Japanese voices. They hit the infiltrators from the flank, surprised them, killed perhaps a dozen before the enemy realized what was happening. For 5 minutes it was hand-to-hand work, rifle butts and bayonets and knives. Bailey was in the middle of it, fighting alongside his men, and they held because he held. The gap closed. The line stabilized. Bailey pulled his survivors back to the original positions and took stock. He had bought perhaps half an hour, maybe less. The Japanese were regrouping, bringing up reserves, preparing to hit again. Ammunition was getting low. Men were exhausted, not from the exertion, though that was real enough, but from the sustained adrenaline, the constant expectation of death. Some were wounded and still fighting. Some were fighting and didn't realize they were wounded. The ridge stank of cordite and blood and fear. Around midnight, the Japanese attacked again, heavier this time, and the right flank began giving way again. Bailey moved Company C forward, extending his line until gaps existed between foxholes. The Japanese came on in a human wave, their doctrine emphasizing shock and momentum. The distance closed to 30 meters. Marines could hear Japanese officers shouting, could hear equipment rattling, individual footsteps. They fired into the darkness and hoped. The Japanese kept coming. 20 meters. Men stopped aiming and started firing from the hip. 15 meters. Marines began pulling back from their foxholes, not from cowardice but from survival instinct. Better to fall back and regroup than die in your hole. It was logical, tactically sound, and absolutely fatal to the defense. Bailey saw it happening. He was standing 10 yards behind the forward line and understood with absolute clarity that this was the moment. If he didn't do something right now, the ridge would fall. He had perhaps 5 seconds to decide. He decided. He stood up, fully upright, in the middle of a firefight, and he started pointing at specific muzzle flashes in the darkness. "There!" he shouted. "That gun, 30 yards out. Put rounds on it." His voice cut through the chaos, clear and authoritative and completely insane. Because standing up in combat is not brave, it's suicide. Every manual, every instructor, every ounce of common sense screams at you to get down, stay low, make yourself small. Bailey did the opposite. He made himself a target. The effect was instant and electric. Japanese gunners saw him. Impossible not to, a man standing when everyone else was prone, and shifted fire. Bullets snapped past his head, cracked through the air around him, kicked up coral dust at his feet. Tracers curved toward him like malevolent fireflies. He didn't move, didn't duck, didn't flinch. He kept pointing, kept shouting, his voice somehow audible over the gunfire. That position, 10 degrees left. Machine gun, base of that tree. Pour it on. And because he could see the muzzle flashes, because he was standing up and had perspective while his Marines were pressed flat and had none, he could direct their fire with terrifying accuracy. A Marine with a bar swung his weapon to where Bailey was pointing and emptied a magazine. The Japanese machine gun went silent. Bailey shifted, pointed again. Grenadier, 100 yards, behind that boulder. Mortar it. A 60mm mortar team adjusted fire, and seconds later the position erupted in a white phosphorus bloom. The Japanese attack wavered, not because they lacked courage but because their support weapons were being systematically destroyed by an enemy who could somehow see in the dark. But Bailey's Marines weren't watching the Japanese. They were watching Bailey, watching him stand there, absorbing fire, refusing to die, and something broke loose in them. Not panic, but its opposite. A kind of furious resolve. If the Major could stand up in this, they could stay in their foxholes. If the Major wasn't running, they weren't running. Fear didn't disappear. Fear never disappears, but it was overridden by something stronger. Not courage exactly. More like shame at the idea of abandoning a man who was deliberately drawing fire to save them. Marines who had been falling back crawled forward again. Marines who had stopped shooting started shooting again. The line held, not because of superior firepower or better positions or any tactical advantage. It held because one man refused to let it break, and made that refusal so visible, so undeniable, that everyone else had no choice but to match it. The Japanese assault broke on that refusal. They came within 10 meters, close enough to throw grenades, close enough for Marines to see faces in the muzzle flashes, and they could not break through. Bailey stayed standing for nearly 10 minutes, directing fire, repositioning men, his voice hoarse but still carrying. Then something hit him above the left eye, split the skin, and blood poured down his face. Head wounds bleed extravagantly. Bailey staggered, dropped to one knee, and for a moment his Marines thought he was finished. He waved them off, wiped blood from his eyes, and stood up again. The bleeding didn't stop. He ignored it. He kept pointing, kept shouting, blood running down his face, and the Marines stopped thinking of him as an officer and started thinking of him as something else. A fixed point, a certainty. The Japanese couldn't kill him, therefore they couldn't win. The assault waves kept coming. 1, 2, 3, each one a little weaker than the last as Japanese casualties mounted. Around 2 in the morning, there was a lull. Not an end to the fighting, but a reduction in intensity as the Japanese pulled back to regroup. Bailey finally allowed himself to be dragged to an aid station. A corpsman tried to bandage his head. Bailey sat still for perhaps 90 seconds, just long enough for the bleeding to slow, then stood up and walked back to the line. The corpsman tried to stop him. Bailey said something that wasn't recorded but that made the corpsman step aside. When Bailey returned, his Marines looked at him with something approaching awe. The bandage on his head was already soaking through. He ignored it. "Check your ammo," he told them. "They'll come again before dawn." They checked their ammo. Most men had fewer than 20 rounds left. Some had fewer than 10. The machine guns were nearly dry. Grenades were gone. If the Japanese attacked again with any strength, there was nothing to stop them except bodies. Around 3 in the morning, the Japanese attacked again, more slowly this time, probing for weaknesses. They had learned respect for the ridge. Bailey moved forward, but this time he didn't stand. Blood loss had weakened him. Instead, he crawled from position to position, redistributing ammunition from the dead to the living, making sure no one felt alone. At one point, a young Marine was curled in his foxhole, rifle abandoned, sobbing from exhaustion and terror. Bailey crawled in beside him, sat with his back against the coral and said, "You know what the Japs are feeling right now? They're tired. They're scared. They're wondering why we won't break. So we're going to stay here until morning, and then they're going to leave." He handed the Marine his own rifle. "Here.
Mines Kleiner.
Use it." Then he crawled to the next position. The Marine picked up the rifle and started firing again. The Japanese never broke through. They tried repeatedly until around 4:30 when the eastern sky began to lighten and darkness evaporated. Then they pulled back in good order, dragging their wounded, leaving their dead. By 5 a.m., the ridge was quiet except for moaning and occasional rifle cracks. By 6 a.m., there was enough light to see what the night had cost. The ridge looked like an abattoir. Dead Japanese lay in piles where assaults had been heaviest, some within 5 meters of American foxholes. The kunai grass was trampled flat, soaked with blood. The smell was indescribable. The Marines had lost approximately 80 dead and 200 wounded. Edson's force of 830 was now barely 550 effectives. The Japanese had lost approximately 850 dead on the ridge itself, with hundreds more wounded. Kawaguchi's assault force was shattered. Henderson Field still stood. Bailey walked the line at dawn, checking positions, making sure the wounded were evacuated. His head wound had stopped bleeding, but the bandage was black and his face was pale. A lieutenant suggested he go to the rear. Bailey said, "After I checked the line." Then he collapsed. Corpsmen carried him to an aid station, where a doctor said he needed evacuation. Bailey refused. He remained with his company. On September 18th, 5 days later, Bailey was ordered to take a patrol south. He led from the front. A Japanese sniper shot him through the chest. He died within minutes. He was 34 years old. The Medal of Honor citation noted that Bailey rendered invaluable service and repeatedly exposed himself to hostile fire. It did not mention what his Marines remembered most. The image of a man standing upright in the middle of a firefight, pointing at targets, refusing to die, holding a line through sheer force of will. There is no doctrine for what Bailey did. You cannot teach it at officer candidate school. It was an act of pure leadership, the conscious decision to make himself a target so his men could see where to shoot, knowing every second increased the probability of his death, and doing it anyway because the alternative was watching his line collapse. It worked not because it was tactically sound, it was insane, but because it was so visibly committed that it shamed fear into silence. The strategic consequences rippled outward. Henderson Field remained operational. American air superiority was maintained. Japanese reinforcement convoys were interdicted. Kawaguchi's brigade never recovered. The myth of Japanese invincibility suffered another blow. Guadalcanal would remain contested for 4 more months, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. The Marines had held, and they had held because one man decided that his life was less important than his men's ability to see where to shoot. The men who fought on Edson's Ridge spoke little about it afterward.
Combat veterans rarely do.
But in letters home, in quiet conversations, in reunions decades later when they were old men with grandchildren, one image appeared again and again. The major, standing upright, blood on his face, pointing into darkness. None could fully articulate what it meant. They simply said he stood up, and because he stood up, they stayed. That was enough. Because the alternative, the admission that without Bailey the ridge would have fallen and all of them would have died, was too large to hold in one mind. War is a test of human endurance under conditions designed to break humans. Machinery fails. Plans disintegrate. What remains is people making choices under fire. Most choices are small, whether to load another magazine, whether to hold for another minute. Occasionally someone makes a different kind of choice. They decide this place, this moment, matters more than their survival. That decision, made visible, changes everything. On the night of September 13, 1942, on a coral ridge in the South Pacific, it changed enough. Henderson Field operated until the end of the war. Pilots flew from it to support campaigns at Bougainville, Rabaul, the Central Solomons. None knew that the runway existed because a Marine major stood up in the dark and refused to sit down. History compresses these details. Official accounts focus on strategic outcomes, casualty figures. The small moments, one man standing, 30 seconds of visible defiance, disappear into footnotes. But those moments are weight-bearing. Remove them and the structure collapses. Modern doctrine emphasizes force multiplication, combined arms, network-centric warfare. These are valuable. They do not address what happens when networks fail and combined arms are unavailable. Then you are back to the same problem faced by every commander since warfare began. How to convince exhausted, terrified people to stay and keep fighting. There is no technological solution. There is only presence. Bailey provided presence through the simple fact of standing where everyone could see him, absorbing risk that should have been distributed across the unit, making that absorption so visible that abandoning him became psychologically impossible. This cannot be taught. It requires a willingness to die that cannot be faked and timing that cannot be calculated. Which is why Edson's Ridge remains an anomaly, a position that should have fallen, held by methods that should not have worked, because one person decided to treat his body as a tool and used it with precision. The ridge itself is still there. Guadalcanal is a sovereign nation now, the war long over, jungle reclaiming contested ground. There is a small monument near where Bailey fell, mostly unvisited. The Kenai grass grows tall. The foxholes have eroded. Nothing indicates that this ground was once the hinge point of empires, that men killed each other here, that the outcome of a global war briefly balanced on whether 830 Marines could hold against 3,000 attackers. History moves on. Ground forgets. But the fact remains. They held. Against doctrine, against probability, against every reasonable expectation. They held because fear was overridden by something else. And that something else had a name, and a face covered in blood, and a voice that kept shouting even when bullets snapped past his head. If you study military history long enough, you encounter moments that don't fit the pattern. Battles that should have ended differently. Men who should have run but didn't. Historians struggle with these anomalies. We want warfare to be systematic, reducible to principles. Mostly it is. But at the edges, in moments of maximum stress, something else emerges. Something older, less quantifiable. Bailey's actions on Edson's Ridge demonstrated a principle. That leadership is the willingness to absorb costs others cannot bear, to make visible the choice to stay when leaving is possible, and to make that visibility so stark it shames others into matching it. The cost was his life 5 days later, on a patrol that should have been routine. Sniper fire is random, impersonal, unlucky. There is no heroic death in modern war. You are there and then you are not. Bailey's Marines grieved briefly, in the way combat troops grieve. Quickly, privately, with no ceremony. Then they kept fighting. That is the final measure of effective leadership. Whether your unit continues after you're gone. Bailey's company continued. They fought at Tarawa, Saipan, Okinawa. Some survived. Some didn't. But they carried the memory of a man standing upright in the dark, pointing at targets, bleeding, refusing to die long enough that everyone else remembered how to fight. So we are left with this. On September 13, 1942, approximately 3,000 Japanese assault troops attacked 830 U.S. Marines defending a ridge south of Henderson Field, Guadalcanal. The Marines held. A Marine major named Kenneth Bailey stood upright under fire to direct his men's defensive fire, was wounded, continued fighting, and died 5 days later. He was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. Henderson Field remained operational. Guadalcanal remained in American hands. These are facts, verifiable, documented. They are also insufficient, because they don't explain why the ridge held when it should have fallen. They don't explain how exhausted men found will when will should have been impossible. They don't explain the alchemy by which one person's refusal to sit down transmuted into 830 people's refusal to retreat. The ridge is quiet now. The men are gone. The war is history. What remains is the example of a moment when everything hung in balance and one person's choice tipped the scale. A man stood up when everyone else was down. His men saw him and did not break. That is what happened. That is all we need to know. If the story meant something to you, if you made it this far and found something here worth your time, consider subscribing to this channel. We tell stories like this one, stories about moments when history pivoted on human choices, when outcomes that seemed determined were altered by acts of will. Consider leaving a like, because it helps others find these stories. And consider this question: if you were in that foxhole on that ridge on that night, if you saw your commanding officer stand up under machine gun fire to show you where to shoot, would you have stayed? Or would you have run? It's easy to say you would have stayed, sitting safely wherever you are now, decades removed from the terror and the darkness and the certainty of death. But the men on Edson's ridge didn't have the luxury of safety or distance. They had only the moment and the choice and the example of a man who refused to sit down. They chose to stay. That choice saved a battle, a campaign, perhaps a war. What would you choose?